I was having a lousy day. It started when the boss chewed me out in front of the whole office for a mistake that I had made on one of the accounts. A client had been overbilled and was using that as a reason not to pay anything. It was stupid and it should not have been a big deal. I mean, it wasn't like anybody was going to die. But that was Mackenzie & Co. advertising agency all over. It was a hothouse of clashing egos, backstabbing and pointing the finger of blame when something went wrong. I was an easy target. It wasn't the first mistake that I had made recently, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. Failure breeds failure just as surely as success follows hot on the heels of success. After the boss had finished telling me what a deadbeat I was, I went out to get a breath of fresh air, just for a couple of minutes while my cheeks stopped burning. I was standing in the little square out front of the office block, taking calming breaths when I felt something strike my shoulder. Something wet and white and disgusting. The bird that had unloaded on my shoulder shrieked and took off from its perch on a window ledge above me. Swearing under my breath, I went to the restroom in the reception area in the hope that I wouldn't bump into any of my colleagues, and spent 20 minutes trying to clean the mess off my shirt. When I got back to my desk, I had 6 missed calls, dozens of new emails, and Peterson in the next booth over looking at me with a contemptuous grin on his face. The day did not improve after this. I drank so much coffee that I got the shakes. I ate an overpriced sandwich at my desk and ended up with fiery indigestion. I sent a visual to the printers that had not been signed off by the client and didn't realize my mistake until it was too late. The copy that I wrote for a new campaign seemed good until Peterson pointed out that it made no sense. I was convinced as well that my suit still smelled like bird crap too. By the time that I finally left the office, my nerves were shredded and I was utterly exhausted. Living the dream, I thought, trying to summon up a smile, but I had nothing. Eyes downcast, feeling older than my 25-year-old self, I set off walking for the train station. Working from home was not permitted by my employer because the boss liked to crack the whip in person, so I had a soul-destroying commute between my home and a distant suburb of the city and the office every day. It was cruel but not unusual. There were countless commuters like me working in the city. We had all had big dreams until reality hit. As I trapezed into the train station, my only ambition was getting back to my bed. I would sleep the sleep of the dead as soon as my head hit the pillow. The platform my train departed from was at the far end of the station. Peak rush hour was over, but there were still plenty of other frazzled-looking commuters on the concourse. A couple of bored-looking uniformed cops were doing a walkthrough as well, nodding now and then as they passed a station employee. There was a row of food stalls, but I ignored them. I couldn't have faced another coffee anyway, and my guts were still churning with indigestion even though I'd eaten nothing since lunch. I carried on until I reached the platform for my train. There were already a couple of dozen people waiting. Some had headphones on. One woman who was around the same age as me wore a fashionable brand that I would have loved to have been able to afford. And almost everybody, as usual, was engrossed in their phones. One haggard-looking man was not, though. He was just staring off into space. He wore a creased, gray suit, and his tie hung at an angle behind a laminated photo ID badge on a lanyard, and years of stress were etched into his face. I feel for your brother, I thought, and then buried my hands in my pockets and waited for the train. 10 minutes later, it pulled into view at its scheduled time. After so many delays and cancellations in the last few months, I was feeling relieved that I was not late as I got on board, and I began to weave through the other passengers looking for a free seat. There was one to my left with plenty of legroom. I beat a harried-looking businesswoman to it and claimed my place. It felt like the first victory that I had had all day. I shuffled around on my backside, trying to get comfy on the hard train seat, sat back, closed my eyes, and tried to relax. But the things that had happened at the office that day were still too raw, and I had a mountain of work waiting for me in the morning. So many problems to untangle. I started to think about an account with an AI startup company. The CEO was an arrogant jerk who kept demanding more and more from me. He was yelling down a video call at me, telling me that I was a loser and that he was going to get me fired. I sat up with a start and I opened my eyes. I had fallen asleep and it had been a stupid dream. I sighed and then noticed the seat next to me was empty. I glanced around. The train had been packed to capacity when it set off, but there were a few more spaces dotted around now. As the train approached its next stop, more passengers rose and headed for the exits. I knew the names of all the stations along the route, and when I saw where we were, I knew there was still an age to go before we made it to my stop. I shuffled again, got as close to comfortable as I was going to get, and I closed my eyes. I suddenly felt like I was falling backwards into a deep, dark space, and I threw myself forward to try and stop. Blinking, realizing that I had been falling asleep again, I sat there staring at the window as the world swept by. There were apartment blocks, a drive-through burger joint, cars backed up on a nearby road. Their headlights were on as the sun set on another fruitless day. I shook my head sadly, wrapped my arms around my chest, and closed my eyes again. A minute later, a loud tinny sound made me look up. A teenager a couple of rows down from me was watching a video on his phone at full volume without headphones on. Whatever he was watching involved somebody screeching with laughter. It lasted for a few seconds and then repeated again and again. I counted to 10. Why did this moron have to subject the rest of us to his mindless garbage? The passengers in range of the sound had thinned out even more by now. I had no idea how many people were in the other carriages, but there were only a dozen or so left in mine. The businesswoman who I had beaten in the seat race earlier included. She looked like she was getting ready to leave at the next stop. The woman who had given me headphone envy was further along the carriage as well. Thanks to her high-spec device, she was clearly oblivious to the maddening sound. The haggard-looking man was still on board as well. His eyes were half shut and his head rocked back and forward slightly with the motion of the train. He must have been so tired that he wasn't aware of the noise, I figured, or maybe he had just lost the strength to care. I had earbuds in my suit pocket and I could have put them in and connected to music on my phone, but I knew they weren't good enough to drown out this screeching on repeat. I looked up and down the carriage. I hadn't seen a conductor yet on the train and it seemed likely that there wasn't one. I had read a news article about cutbacks in the city's transportation budget, meaning that a lot of trains would only have drivers and how the unions were protesting. And I hadn't cared until that moment in time. If there had been a conductor, I could have complained to them instead of having to tell the teenager to shut it myself. I was so tired though. This was the last thing that I needed. I decided to leave it to somebody else to speak up and screwed my eyes shut. The noise continued to cut through and I gritted my teeth. And then it started to sound like it was on the move. I opened one eye and saw that the teenager was heading for the door. The train came to a halt, the door slid open and he stepped off. I swore gratefully under my breath. A few more passengers left at the same stop. I watched them drifting down the platform as the train pulled away. It was fully dark outside by now, and once the latest station was out of sight, the only lights that I could see were from the occasional building. There was still a way to go before we reached my distant suburb though, so I sat back once again and tried to relax. Only that still wasn't happening. I needed to go to the bathroom. This was something best avoided on the commuter train that I caught each day. There were restrooms at either end of the train, but they could be horror shows when it came to hygiene. I tried to ignore my bladder, but some things just won't go away. I pushed myself to my feet and walked down to the nearest restroom. Illuminated red letters and a little panel by the door informed me that it was out of order. Typical, I thought, and walked back along the length of the train to see if I would have any more luck with the other one. There were half a dozen carriages and some of them were completely deserted as I passed through them. The others had the odd person dotted here and there. At least there won't be a queue, I thought. And thankfully, the second restroom was in working order and vacant. The smell that greeted me when the door switched open was grim, and there was nowhere that I could put my feet where my shoes wouldn't get wet. I did what I needed to do and I got out of there. I could have sat pretty much anywhere by now, but commuters are creatures of habit and that was no different. And so I returned to what I thought of as my carriage and my seat. Though without thinking that at all, if you know what I mean. The woman with the fabulous headphones was still there, still happily in their noise-canceling embrace as far as I could see. The haggard-looking man was still there as well. I could see the bald spot on the back of his scalp as I approached. That was it for passengers, though. I was the only other person in the carriage. Hoping finally that I could spend the remainder of the journey chilling out, I continued to my seat. But as I passed the haggard-looking man, I noticed that his face was coated in sweat. His neck above his creased collar and crooked tie and photo ID glistened as well, and the two bright electric lights of the train. His skin almost seemed pale, even beneath the sheen of perspiration. I tried to remember if he looked that washed out when I had first seen him, and there was no avoiding the fact that he hadn't. I hesitated. The only things that I knew about medicine came from working on the account of a plastic surgery practice, and it was clear this man didn't need a tummy tuck or liposuction. He appeared to need medical assistance. Still, I just stood there. The man was a complete stranger, and didn't I have enough problems on my own? I told myself. This had nothing to do with me. I started to turn away, but as I did, a low guttural noise started to come out of the man's mouth. It wasn't a snore. It sounded wrong, like there was a serious problem with his breathing. The words death rattle popped into my head. I tried to shake them out of my thoughts and reluctantly figured that I should get involved. "Hey mister, you okay?" I asked. There was no sign that he had heard me. The sound just kept coming from in between his lips, that slow, jarring rattle. Now that I was on this course, I persevered and tried. "Do you want me to get help?" With no conductor and barely any other passengers, I didn't know where I would have gotten help from if he had answered that he would. But once again, there was no response. I paced up and down trying to think. I came to the conclusion that I did need to try and get help regardless, and not from asking if there was a doctor on the train because the odds of that were way too short. I took out my phone and I dialed 911. It felt like a long time before the call was answered, long enough for the train to make another stop and discard more passengers, and for me to consider hanging up and walking away after all. But then the dispatcher picked up. I answered all their questions, giving them my name and then my location as best as I could based on the train that I was on, the last station that I had seen, and the next one that I knew to be coming up. I described the way the man looked and the sound that he was making, and then the dispatcher asked what the man's name was. I told them that I had no idea, but added that the man had an ID and a lanyard around his neck. I leaned closer so that I could see what it said. The photograph showed the man in better days. There was even the hint of a smile on his lips. His name was printed below the picture, so I read this out to the dispatcher, spelling the surname, and then kept reading the text that followed. It said, "Research Associate, Stoller Institute." After this, the dispatcher asked me to hold for a moment, leaving me listening to a dull buzz, and leaving my mind free to wander. I had never heard of the Stoller Institute, so I had no idea what type of research this fellow spent his days doing. It could have been something dry and academic. Somebody had to research economic trends, I figured. Or it could have been rocket science or even something medical. If only you had taken your turn for the worse while you were still at work, there would be no end of doctors to help out, I thought. Medical or biological. Perhaps he researched what happened when you emptied the contents of test tube A onto sample B. The possibilities were endless, as was this call, it seemed. Finally, there was a click and the dispatcher came back on the line. Only this time it sounded like someone different was speaking when they had asked, "How many people are on the train?" I was thrown off by this and said uncertainly, Me and a lady in this carriage. Maybe a handful more on the rest of the train. No conductor, I think. A driver, though, I guess." There was a pause and a new voice said, "I need you and the female passenger to leave the carriage that you're in and go to the front carriage in the train. Any other passengers that you see are to do the same." I was so thrown off by this that I couldn't speak. "Is that clear?" the voice said. There was an edge to their tone that unsettled me even more. "Yes," I managed to say. "But why? What's wrong?" I was still staring at the man in the seat as I said this, seeing the sweat glint on his pale skin, hearing the rattle of his breath. And I thought of my flight of fancy, of test tube A and sample B, and what might be brewed and breathed in. "Oh," I muttered to myself as much to the voice on the other end of the line, and I asked, "Is he infectious? Is that why you're telling me to get away from him?" There was no reply from the voice on the line. I swallowed. My throat suddenly felt very dry and my skin felt very hot. "What is it?" I asked, the questions tumbling out as panic built inside me. "What has he got?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched on a moment longer and then the voice said, "Leave the carriage that you're in and go to the front carriage. Ensure that everybody else does the same." Not even asking me, but ordering me, and not explaining a thing. I kept staring at the man in the seat in front of me, and I could see a patch of discoloration now in his skin, just below his left eye. It hadn't been there before. It made me think of decay. Still holding the phone to my ear, I began to back away. I stumbled into the edge of a seat, righted myself, and took a few more steps until I was in the eye line of the woman with the designer headphones on. "We have to move," I said to her. She clearly couldn't hear me because of her headphones, but there was no way that she couldn't have seen me, which meant that she was blanking me. I mimed, taking headphones off, and mouthed, "You have to listen to me." She kept blanking me. I didn't get it at first, but then I did. She was a woman on her own late at night on a near deserted train, and a man she didn't know was in her personal space acting agitated. I took a few more steps away from her, held my palms up, hopefully showing her that I meant no harm. "Please," I said slowly and clearly, "there is a problem." Even though she couldn't hear me, she would be able to lip read. And finally she reacted. She reached into her bag and took out a small canister. "This is mace," she said. "If you don't go away, you're going to get the contents in your eyes. And trust me, buddy, it's gonna hurt." I could have wept even without being maced. I shook my head, waved my hand slowly from side to side in front of my face, trying to make her understand. Drawing out each syllable, I said, "Infectious," and pointed over at her towards the man. She was directing the mace at me but not pressing the release. "Infectious," I said again, and she must have been watching my lips and understood what I was saying, because she lowered the mace and turned to look at the man with a concerned expression on her face. And then she looked at me and swore out loud. She took her headphones off, lowered them till they were around her neck, and got unsteadily to her feet. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know," I replied honestly. I called 911 and the dispatcher saying that we should put distance between ourselves and the man. I didn't add that the dispatcher hadn't confirmed this was because of the danger of infection, or tell her about the edge in their voice. There was something very wrong here, and I wasn't going to hang around for the details. "Come on," I said, and started to walk away on legs that felt hollow. The woman followed without saying anything else. And just before I stepped through the connecting doors into the next carriage, I glanced back at the man. Even from a distance, I could see the discoloration had spread. It looked like a shadow was falling over one half of his face. I shivered and put one foot in front of the other. As we moved through the carriages, I couldn't see any other passengers, Everybody else must have gotten off, I figured, which was good. It meant that I didn't have to persuade any more reluctant strangers to move. A few long minutes later, the woman and I had reached the front carriage. There was a door at the far end which I assumed led to the driver's cabin. I wondered if I should hammer on it to get the driver's attention, or even pull the emergency lever. My head was spinning by now and I just didn't know. And then I remembered that I was still holding my phone. I brought it closer and asked, "Are you still there?" "Yes," the voice replied. "Have you made it to the front carriage?" We have. There's only 2 of us left in the train though. What should we do?" The answer was given straight off this time. "Stay where you are. The Alpha team has been mobilized." I had never heard paramedics or other first responders referred to like that before, but I told myself not to sweat the details. Help was on the way. And even better than that, I had a bright idea. "Hey," I said, down the phone. "There's another stop coming up soon. We can get off there. It'll be safer." I waited for the voice to agree that this was the sensible course of action, but there was no response. The woman had been following my side of the conversation. I smiled in what I hoped was a reassuring way and said, "Just waiting to hear back what they think. They're probably talking to the driver as well and updating the first responders to send them to the station." I was only too eager to fill in the gaps and hurry things along to where somebody else would take care of everything. The woman didn't look convinced though, but the next station was coming up now. I smiled at her, anticipating the train slowing and then pulling to a halt. We could step out into the cool night air. Only the train wasn't slowing. I could see the platform approaching the station name sign and then we were passing it at speed. I didn't understand. "We didn't stop," I cried into the phone. It took me a moment to realize that the line was dead. I looked at the phone dumbly and then looked at the woman. She asked, "What's going on?" I had no idea and I was still thinking what to say when there was an announcement on the train's public address system. "This is the driver. I have been informed there's a medical emergency on board, and we're proceeding direct to the next station where paramedics are waiting." I felt relief flooding through me. Everything was going to be okay. Somebody else was going to take care of things. I grinned goofily at the woman and she smiled back at me. For the first time, I thought how pretty she was. I was single but didn't want to be and wondered if she might give me her phone number if I asked. I was wondering if this was the right moment to ask as the train entered a tunnel. Through the train window, I could see the dark tunnel wall slipping by. And then the train jolted to a halt. I was thrown sideways but managed to stay on my feet. "What the?" I began to exclaim but didn't finish because the inside of the train was suddenly plunged into darkness. I couldn't see a single thing until a small square light appeared. It was illuminating the nervous smile on the woman's face as she held up her phone. She turned the phone's flashlight towards me and said, "Call 911 again." Now I could see my screen, but I put my passcode in, and then cursed and told her, "No signal." She angled her phone back towards herself and stabbed at it with her fingers before saying, "Same here." It was time to get the driver's attention directly. I figured and turned my phone's flashlight on to find the emergency lever. Before I could, the door to the cabin clicked loudly and opened. A bulky figure appeared in the doorway. He was wearing a train company uniform and looked about 60. He had a flashlight as well, a proper one, not just a feature on a phone. He raised the beam and took in the pair of us standing there and asked in a gravelly voice, "Are you folks okay?" Not really, I thought, but I followed the lead of the woman when she started to nod. "Good," he said as he growled in his deep voice. "Well, I'll be honest with you good people. I don't rightly know what's going on here. First I get the call telling me to hightail it to the next station along so the sick person on board can get medical assistance as soon as possible. And then when I get into the tunnel I see there's a red light, which means that I can't hightail it anywhere. I put the brakes on then and called for an update, but nobody's answering me. It's strange, I tell you, mighty strange. Well, can't you drive on anyway? The woman asked. It surely can't be safe staying here. His wide shoulders shrugged as he responded. There's a red light ahead. It doesn't matter what else is going on. No train driver will ever ignore a red light and continue through it. I don't want my grandkids to see my name on the news as the guy who caused people to lose their lives in a crash. But while I'm waiting for the controllers to pull their fingers out, I figured I should go see if I can help the passenger who's in distress. He raised the first aid box that he held in his other hand so that we could see it. The woman beat me to the draw when she said, "We need to stay away from him, he's infectious." She turned to me and added, "That's right, isn't it? The dispatcher told you." I studied my feet in the gloom. I didn't want to admit that I had been told no such thing, that I had been led to that conclusion by fear. Probably, I mumbled. It was the best that I could do, and I hated the sound of my voice at that moment. "Well," the driver growled, "I don't know rightly what that means either, but I'm not gonna stand here debating who said what while there's somebody on this train who needs a helping hand." And with that, he began to walk off down the train. I stayed rooted to the spot. The woman started to follow him. I really didn't want to go back that way, but I also didn't want to be on my own. I had seen enough scary movies to know what happened to the person who was left on their own in the dark. Muttering obscenities, I set off after them. The carriages were transformed by the darkness into one long, ominous passageway. Ahead of me, I could make out the edges of the driver's flashlight in two shadowy forms. They were moving rapidly towards where the man sat. My heart beating faster and faster, I kept pace. And there he was, the man still slumped against the seat. I could only see his legs at first. The driver was blocking my view and the woman standing off to one side. She had a hand over her mouth as if she was stifling a scream. I took another step forwards. I felt compelled to see now. I needed to know what was revealed in the beam of the flashlight. I moved in between the driver and the woman and cold fear rushed through me. The discoloration on the man's face had continued to spread. His skin, where it was exposed, was a dark layer of decaying matter. And on his face, around his eyes, his rotting flesh had collapsed inwards, exposing the pale orbs of his eyes in all their fullness. They were staring blindly into the flashlight's beam. As my mind processed this hideous sight, I noticed that there were flies crawling through the man's scalp as well. The only small mercy was that the rattling sound had ceased. His mouth hung open, but there was no breathing going on. He was dead. I swallowed down the bile which had risen into the back of my mouth and turned to the driver and said in a hoarse and shaky voice, "Satisfied now?" "I don't understand," he said. "Yeah, me neither," I told him. "Can we get out of here and leave it to the authorities?" He tore his gaze away from the decomposing corpse and lowered his flashlight, casting the dead man back into the darkness. And then he said, "You're right, we should get out of here. There's a control for the doors at the rear of the train. We can use that to get out and walk along the tracks." I told him that sounded good to me. The woman hesitated. She was still looking at the body. "We should cover him up. It's the decent thing to do." "There is no decency in this place, in my opinion. There was sickness and death." "Forget it," I said, and put a hand on her elbow. Barely touching her, I just wanted her to hurry up. She did start to move. I was alongside her. The driver was in the lead, using his flashlight to show the way. But then she hesitated again. She turned to look back and her mouth opened. And this time she did scream. I span around. The driver flashed the beam towards where we had been. The corpse was no longer slumped on the seat. It was standing up. I rubbed my eyes and told myself that I was seeing things, but when I looked again, the corpse was still there. Its back was to us and it was completely still. The only movement was the small cloud of flies buzzing around its head. They must have flown off when he stood. The flies had left the building, I thought, and a hysterical laugh bubbled inside me. This was insane. the dead did not rise. Only this nightmare vision had. It had stood up and now it was turning, slowly and carefully, as it was trying to remember how to move. And now it was looking at us with its bulging bloodshot eyes. Its cracked lips were twitching and drawing back to reveal yellow teeth. Its arms were lifting and its hands reaching out towards us, seeming to grasp at the flashlight's beam. And then it began to shuffle towards us, inch by inch. "Run," I heard the driver say this, but I couldn't respond. "Now." His voice rose over the sound of my ragged breathing, but I still couldn't react. I was aware that by my side the woman was moving. I felt her hand on my cheek and she turned my head so that we were looking at each other. I was aware that tears were running down her face. "Please," she said quietly, "we have to run." I nodded and snapped out of my daze, and together the three of us stumbled away. The risen corpse followed, but its movements were so clumsy and unsure that it could not match our speed. It threw its head back and a distorted howl filled the carriage. It was thick with anger and pain and frustration. We were escaping its foul rage. The driver reached a door at the end of the final carriage, unlocked it, and disappeared inside. The light on the door lock glowed. I slammed my hand against it as the driver reappeared. The door opened and he led the way out. There was a jump down to reach the ground. After closing and locking the door using a button behind a hatch in the side of the train, the driver said, "Keep to the edge. The live track is in the center. You'll be fried if you step on it." I squeezed as close against the tunnel wall as I could get, and I hurried along until I emerged into the night air. There were stars in the sky, but there were no street lamps or buildings or vehicles in sight. "It's a long walk to the nearest platform," the driver said. "And for safety's sake, we should get off the tracks now and follow the line from alongside it." His flashlight illuminated a weed-covered verge at shoulder height that ran alongside the tracks. I scrambled up onto it first. The woman followed, but as she clambered up over the edge, she cursed. "I've dropped my phone," she said. The driver laughed. It was good to hear someone laugh, especially him. He had a deep, warm laugh. "Don't worry about it, little lady. I can see it just there. I'll get it and then join you." He took a few steps forwards, leaned over, and when he stood up straight, he had the phone in his hand. The woman gave him a thumbs up, but then she froze. There was a new sound in the air, a clattering noise. We all looked in the direction that the sound was coming from and saw the helicopter as it came into view. The driver whooped and said, "There's the cavalry." He started to walk along the edge of the tracks towards the approaching helicopter, the recovered phone in one hand, his flashlight in the other. He began to wave his arms in the air. "Down here," he yelled. From the verge, the woman and I watched. I started to get a bad feeling. Why was there a helicopter? An ambulance or a police cruiser off-roading into view would have been a welcome sight. But this dark shape, growing in the night sky, its blades turning, its engine roaring, seemed out of place. The woman must have picked up on my unease because she said, "It'll be an air ambulance. It's the quickest way to get help here." Which it would have made sense, but the helicopter was close enough now for me to see that there were no markings on it. An air ambulance would have had some kind of healthcare cross, surely. It dipped and slowed and began to hover a few dozen feet in front of the driver. He had stopped waving his arms. I think that he had realized something was wrong as well, and he was hideously right. There was the sharp crack of a weapon being fired from the helicopter. He span and fell. I waited for him to move, and I begged silently for him to move, but he just lay there. Enclosed in the darkness of the night, the woman whispered, "They murdered him." I was too shocked to say anything. It seemed hideously clear that whoever was in the helicopter had not come to help. They were agents of malevolence. Survival instincts kicking in, and I began to shuffle backwards, keeping as low as possible and making as little noise as I could. The crew of the helicopter hadn't shown any signs that they knew the woman and I were there on the verge, and we needed to keep it that way. The woman clearly got that. She rolled over onto her front and began to crawl after me. She caught up with me and tugged my sleeve, pointed at something behind me. I twisted my neck around and saw a line of trees. While the helicopter's engine continued to growl threateningly, we scrambled into the extra cover that they provided and knelt there trying to catch our breath. I didn't dare turn on the flashlight on my phone, but my eyes had begun to adjust to the darkness so that I could see tears were falling down her face. "I didn't even know the driver's name," she said. I thought how the driver had mentioned that he had grandkids, and a cold, sick feeling filled my stomach. "Me neither," I said. The woman exhaled deeply and then held out a hand. "I'm Helen, by the way." "James," I replied, and we shook hands. It was crazily formal given our situation, but somehow felt like the right thing to do. "Pleased to meet you, James. So what on earth do we do now?" I breathed out. "Honestly, I don't know. I could call 911 again, but I suspect any call from my phone will be transferred straight to whoever sent that helicopter." "You know that you sound out there, like conspiracy theory paranoid," Helen said. I shrugged. "I don't think it counts as paranoia if they're out to get you." "A fair comment. How about family friends, somebody that you can trust?" I lived alone and my social life was non-existent and my parents had passed away. "No. How about you?" "I moved halfway across the country to begin a new life with my boyfriend, but left him last week when I found out that he was cheating on me and I..." Her voice began to break and she couldn't go on. I was trying to think what I could say when the sound of an explosion filled the night. We both instinctively flinched and covered our heads with our hands. After a moment, I looked up. "Are you hurt?" I asked Helen. She answered, "Shook up, but no, I think I'm fine." The explosion sounded like it came from over by the train tracks. She crept forward and peered out into the night. I shuffled alongside her and swore silently. There was smoke streaming out of the entrance to the tunnel and the helicopter was circling high above. "I think they just fired a missile at the train," Helen whispered. "Yeah, destroying the evidence," I added in a shocked whisper of my own. As smoke continued to billow from the tunnel, the helicopter veered away. The silence that it left behind didn't last for long. In the distance, sirens began to sound. Their cries sent fresh waves of fear through me. "We need to get out of here, now." I gave her a thumbs up and together we scrambled deeper into the woods. My mind was racing with chaotic thoughts. I had gone from being a downtrodden advertising executive to a fugitive in a day, and I had no idea where I was heading or what might be waiting for me. I glanced over at Helen. A line of red had raised on her cheek where she must have been scratched by a branch, and she had a set, determined expression on her face. Hey, at least I'm not alone, I thought, and I hurried on through the darkness as the sounds of the sirens rose and fell in the night. We stumbled on. A while later, I honestly can't say how long or how far we had gone from the tracks in the tunnel. The trees began to thin out. There was a building visible on the open ground. And I was done. I sat down heavily and gasped. "I can't take another step, I'm sorry." Helen sat on the ground beside me. She was shaking and breathing heavily. It took her a minute before she could speak. "Can you use your phone to try and find our location? It's not much, but it's a start." "Sure," I replied. I took my phone out and smiled when I saw that I had 3 bars. There was also a news alert on the screen. The headline displayed sent a chill down my spine. "Commuter train destroyed in collision with freight train." I clicked on the link and held the phone out so that Helen could read the story as well. It detailed how a passenger train had broken down in a tunnel and been struck at speed by a freight train transporting chemicals cross-country. The driver of the commuter train was confirmed as a fatality, and there was the possibility of more. Sources were quoted saying the cause that led to this tragic accident were being investigated. but it was believed a signal fault could have been to blame. I felt sickened by what I had read. It's all lies, a cover-up. Helen looked at me and said bitterly, I wonder if we'll be among the fatalities when they add to the lies later on. I hesitated. I hated myself for the thought that had just occurred to me, but I decided that I couldn't keep it to myself. Which could be a good thing, I said quietly. It would mean they think that we're still on the train when they destroyed it. It would mean that we could walk away from this. Helen looked disgusted, and honestly, I didn't blame her. I just can't walk away from this, she said. I can't forget the driver or the man who became that thing on the train. He was a human once, just like you and me. Though maybe he was better than us and he had people who cared about him. A wife, children. I don't know, but it strikes me he's a victim here as well. I couldn't even look at her. I was so ashamed. I thought desperately how to redeem myself, and inspiration struck. There should be a phone number or an email for the news desk, I told her. I can contact them and tell them the truth. I found a phone number and was about to call it when Helen put her hand on my wrist. Wait, she said. We don't actually know if they think that we're dead. They could still be looking for us. I guess, I replied hesitantly. But why should that stop me from phoning the news desk? A journalist won't give us up to the authorities, and once the story is out, then we'll be fireproof. She shook her head. It won't get that far. They have your name and number from the 911 call that you made. The minute that you make a phone call, it could set off an alert that they've set up to cover the bases. My finger hovered over the keypad, and this was a nightmare. Every action could have a negative consequence. There could be danger no matter what we did or where we went. There were shadows everywhere. I looked at my phone and said, Yeah, now that I think about it, I believe the authorities can track your location from your phone. You don't even need to be using it to make a call, it just needs to be turned on. Helen cursed, which I took to mean that she agreed with me. I didn't make the call. I turned the phone off, and for safe measure, I took out the SIM card and battery and I threw them away. And this didn't help my nerves one bit though. Neither did Helen, crawling forwards. Wait, I hissed. We can't just stay here, she whispered back. I waited for a moment, hoping hysterically that the ground would open up and swallow me and then I wouldn't have to do anything. But the ground remained hard and cold beneath my feet. So I took a deep breath and followed. Coming closer, I saw that the building was a diner. There was a single truck parked up outside, and there was a man outlined in the light from the window. He was smoking a cigarette and yawning. After taking a last drag on the cigarette, he crushed the butt underfoot and then headed for the truck. Helen was watching him, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. I was wishing that I had met her in different circumstances. Encountering a zombie, being on the run, and one wrong move away from an early grave was hardly an ideal first date in anybody's books. I realized that she was looking at me, gawping at her. I must have been an open book because she said, I'm not sure this is the time or place for getting romantic. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but then she smiled, and there was a gentle twinkle in her eyes that made me feel better. I asked, So, if this isn't the moment for a proposal, what do you think our next step should be? She answered decisively, Keep moving, keep putting distance between ourselves and the tunnel. Once we have some breathing space, then maybe we think properly of a way out of this, and I can see our ride about to depart. She got to her feet, strode right up to the trucker and asked him for a ride. And 5 minutes later, we were on the road. We passed police cars speeding down the highway, their sirens flashing, and each time I saw one, my stomach cramped up. But thankfully, they were all heading in the opposite direction. I wondered if they knew what had really happened at the tunnel and decided that they probably did not. The rank and file would be kept in the dark by the high-ranking officials pulling the strings. They knew the truth, and so did I. It was a heavy burden to carry, but even so, as the night slipped by, I found my eyelids growing heavy. The cabin was dark and hot, and I must have fallen asleep because I found myself being shaken awake by Helen. I blinked at her and rubbed my eyes. "Time to go," she said. I saw that dawn was close and that we appeared to be on the outskirts of a city. There were high-rises in the distance, and the buildings on either side of the road were 1- or 2-story structures. Many of them looked to be run down. The signs on shop fronts were faded, and there was graffiti on walls and boarded-up windows. Helen turned to the driver and said, "Could you pull up here?" The truck rattled to a halt and we clambered out. "Why did you want to get out here?" I asked. "Surely we would have been better going into the city center. It would be safer, and there are shops that don't look as if they're about to fall down, and we could have found somewhere to stay." "We already have somewhere to stay," she replied with a deadpan expression on her face. Linking her arm in mine, she led me back down the street. We passed the seediest-looking bar that I had ever seen. There were steel shutters over the windows and music, and the sound of breaking glass drifted out of the door. Further down the street, we reached a building that stood on its own in between 2 empty lots. It looked to me like it should have been knocked down as well, but the hotel stood there in all its shabby glory. There was a vacancy sign in one of the windows. "Gee, that's a pleasant surprise," I muttered. "I would have thought they would have been all booked out." Helen gave me a playful tap on the back of the head and told me that I was a wise ass. After we had checked in, paying cash to a man behind the desk, wearing a white vest and with dark hair sprouting from his shoulders, and we were in our room, Helen explained why this dive was ideal for us. "If they're laying digital traps, they could have facial tracking software set up to look out for you on CCTV cameras. The city's center will be full of them, but there will be a lot less around here, and I definitely didn't see any on the street when the truck drove down it." "But how would they know what I look like?" I asked. "Well, they know your name and phone number. It's simple enough after that to find your social media or your company's personal page online. And a snapshot of you is just the start of it. They can easily find where you bank, get the details in your account, and set up another alert which will go off if you use your card." I was sitting on the lumpy bed as she spoke and started to feel that all hope was draining away. "So I can't contact anyone. I need to stay away from cameras on the street, and I can't use my card. Well, what can I do?" I asked. She actually smiled when she answered. "They don't know who I am, so you sit pretty while I go shopping." And with that, she was gone. Left alone in the dank, grim room, I started to worry that she wouldn't come back. I mean, why would she stay? She had a credit card that she could use and could have been on a bus heading to anywhere in the country easily enough. I sat there and sweated for what felt like a very long time. When Helen returned, I was so relieved that I leapt to my feet and stood there watching wide-eyed as she put the things that she had bought on the bed. There was cola and snacks, toothbrushes and toothpaste, and a change of clothes for both of us, and a laptop computer that looked about 10 years old. "I got it from a shop that sold everything from rat poison to dumbbells to these." She said and took a USB out of her pocket. "Pay-as-you-go internet connection," she explained. "Now let's bring ourselves up to speed." We started with a news search for the incident by the tunnel. The story had spread across a lot of outlets, but there were no updates, which meant no confirmation of other casualties yet. A good thing in a way. It meant that I might be a dead man in the authorities' eyes, and all the alerts that we were worrying about were a figment of our paranoid imaginations. The next thing that we did was go on the website for the Stoller Institute. They had employed the zombie as a research associate before he had turned. A quick scan of the About Us section showed that they carried out cutting-edge work in biochemistry through contracts for high-end corporate and government clients. It was light on the details and heavy on the buzzwords. Glossy text that somebody like me could have written. And then we went to the Who We Are page and hurried past the CEO, directors, and the heads of departments until we had reached a listing for the research associates. The man who had been on the train was not listed. It's even easier to delete somebody's digital footprint than find out what they had for breakfast. Helen commented and opened a bag of potato chips. We spent the rest of the day checking for news updates, snacking and catching up on our sleep. I slept in a chair that had seen much better days. Helen crawled under the covers on the bed. She still wore the headphones around her neck and pulled them over her ears before closing her eyes. I don't think she turned them on to listen to music. It was more of a comfort thing. In the evening, she went out to get a pizza. While we were tucking in, I thought for the first time about my job. When I didn't show up that morning, did anybody worry about me? I wondered. Probably not, I soon decided. It was more likely that they already fired me and were hiring some other poor slob to treat like dirt. Good luck to them, I thought, and bit into another slice of pizza. Our days and nights settled into a strange rhythm after this. Helen added old-school paper copies of local and national newspapers to the shopping list, which we devoured along with online outlets for any updates on the tunnel incident. There were no details, though, and the story lost traction as time wore on. It appeared the authorities' lies were sinking out of sight. But we did find other stories. The CEO of the Stoller Institute was struck by a car and killed while out jogging. The driver hadn't stopped and the police had no leads. A warehouse in the same district as the Stoller Institute headquarters was gutted by a fire. With a little digital detective work, we found out that it was owned by a subsidiary of the institute, and a military helicopter crashed in what was described as a tragic training accident. There were no survivors among the crew. Anyone else who might have come across these stories would most likely have thought that they were unconnected happenings in the daily news cycle. But we saw the connection. We knew that the cover-up was ongoing. After a week, though, the original stories about the so-called collision at the tunnel had still not been updated, and were being relegated to the archives section of the news sites. And there were no new articles which we could link to the cover-up. The pressure felt as if it was lifting, and I started to feel safer. One morning while Helen was out on her daily shop, I sat on the bed staring at the same four walls. The room was disgusting and cramped, and I had a sudden desperate urge to get out of there. Just to stretch my legs for 10 minutes, I thought. Surely it couldn't do any harm, and Helen would not even have to know that I had left the hotel. With my mind made up, I went out for the first time since we had checked in, and boy did it feel good. Even though the neighborhood was run down, being out in the fresh air and able to just walk wherever I wanted was such a relief. I crossed one of the empty lots, stepping around to broken bricks, and walked along a street, and I was surprised to find that I was at the entrance to a small park. It was overgrown and there was broken glass and cigarette butts scattered around, but when I sat on one of the wooden benches at its edge, I could have been in a carefully tended grand city park from the smile on my face. I knew that Helen would be back soon enough, so I had to drag myself away before I would have liked. I was in a bit of a daze as I headed back to the hotel, so much so that I took a wrong turn and found myself on the wrong street. I figured that it ran parallel to where I wanted to be, so no big deal, and I continued to the end of the street so that I could hang a right. There was a drugstore on the corner, and fixed to the wall across from it was a CCTV camera. The happiness that I had been feeling drained away. Not only was I in line with the camera's lens, but I was staring right at it. I panicked and began to walk away. It was less than a minute before I was back at the hotel, and then I was running to the room, unlocking the door with shaking hands and hurrying inside. I sat on the floor in a corner with my knees hugged against my chest, and I felt my heart beating as if it was fit to burst. When Helen got back 30 minutes later, there was no point in me even pretending that everything was all right. I told her what had happened. She heard me out and then started to pace around the room swearing. It might be okay, I tried. Her pacing had brought her to the window. She turned and looked out into the street. It is not. They're here. I jumped to my feet and went over to the window. There was a dark van parked in the corner just down from the drugstore, and another one parking up close to the bar. Men and women with short military-style haircuts and wearing plain business suits were getting out and hammering on doors, showing IDs, and when the doors were opened, then pushing their way inside. My face had been tagged by a program somewhere and an alert had been sent out. Teams were dispatched and now it was only a matter of time before they made it to the hotel and knocked on our door. They knew that I was alive and the cover-up was back on. "We have to go now," Helen said and sprinted for the door. I stayed where I was at. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Leave me here," I said. "They still don't even know who you are. You should get away while you can." She replied without missing a beat. "No way, we're in this together. We can back up each other's stories when we do go public, and besides..." She did hesitate now and glanced away for a second before going on. "Besides, I've grown kind of fond of you. It's still a lousy moment to propose, but you never know. One day." It was a crazy time for her to be saying this. Crazier than when we had introduced ourselves with a formal handshake. But it worked for me. I hurried over to her side and we ran for the exit. But we were too late. One of the suited, stern-faced women was showing her ID to the receptionist. He looked worried and then his eyes lit up as he spotted us. "That's the man you're looking for," he yelled, "with his girlfriend." The woman span around and a smile of triumph flickered on her face. She reached for the holster at her waist, but she did not make it. Helen threw herself forward and knocked the other woman off her feet, and then Helen was jumping over the prone woman and screaming at me to move it. I did not need to hear it twice. I vaulted the woman, narrowly avoiding a flailing shoe as she tried to kick my ankles. She had the sidearm in her hand now as well, and was aiming. I hurtled out onto the street. There were more suited figures across the road, and they were turning to look at us. And then the sound of a gun being fired rang out. The woman had taken a shot. Her colleagues reacted instinctively by crouching, and that gave us a second. We sprinted down the street. We didn't look back as more shots rang out and voices yelled at us to stop. We weaved chaotically through narrow lanes and scrambled over broken walls until Helen shouted, "In here!" and she grabbed me by the arm and led us into a derelict building. I sank to my knees. Helen sat heavily against a wall and placed a hand on her stomach, where blood had spread through the fabric of her t-shirt. She lifted the bottom of the shirt and looked at the wound. "Never been shot before," she said and laughed bitterly. She had started to shake and was breathing rapidly. I moved closer and I took her hand in mine. "Hey, you're gonna be fine," I said. "We'll get you to the ER, and while they're fixing you up, I'm gonna tell the world about these stone-cold killers." Another harsh laugh rippled through her. It clearly hurt. She put a hand on my cheek and somehow smiled. "That's not gonna happen," she said, her voice reduced to a whisper, and each word causing her a fresh wave of pain. "You need to go. You can't use either of our cards now. You need cash. Take these." She took her headphones off and pushed them against my chest. The headphones that had been the first thing that I had noticed about her in what felt like a lifetime ago. "No, I can't," I said and gently pushed the headphones back towards her. A new, crooked smile appeared on her face. "Don't be an idiot. Take them, sell them, and keep going until you're safe. And one word of advice, you sweet, lovely man. Don't use the train." She was the most amazing person that I had ever met, the most beautiful woman. I kissed her on the forehead and said to her for the first time, "I love you." But I was too late. She was gone. I did as she told me, and despite the odds stacked against me, I made it. I'm south of the border now, living off-grid. The pain that I feel from losing Helen burns in me every moment of every day, and it drives me on. They tried to silence me and they failed. I know about the zombie virus, and one day soon the truth will prevail.